Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the story of Thomas Ratchford and the murder of Elizabeth Kirk, which took place in Newcastle Upon Tyne in 1881. In some areas of this story there is a little less evidence than usual, so this may be a little shorter than normal, but I hope you will still find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And as I always do now, I would just like to add that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. Thomas Ratchford was born in around 1832 in Lancashire. His mother's name is unknown, but his father was called James, and he was one of at least two children. He married a lady by the name of Sarah in around 1860, and by 1861 the couple were living in Durham and had one child, a daughter. From information I found in 1871, Thomas was listed as a widow and was living in Newcastle with his young son. Thomas worked as a hawker selling hats and caps, and was also listed as someone who actually made the caps that he sold. He was not described by those who knew him as a very heavy drinker, but he was known to drink to some extent. Elizabeth Kirk, the victim, was born in around 1838, possibly in Gateshead. Her parents and other family members are unknown. In 1871 she was listed as living in the home of Thomas Ratchford, and although the neighbours believed that they lived together as man and wife, she was described in that census as a servant and someone who helped to make the caps that Thomas sold. Elizabeth was a widow, and it seems that she had lost both her husband and her young son within 2 years of each other. And unlike Thomas, Elizabeth was described as being a very heavy drinker. Early on the morning of Saturday, August the 12th, 1871, Thomas Ratchford went into the Ridley Arms in Newcastle in search of Elizabeth Kirk. He found her there drinking with a man and woman who he did not know. He asked Elizabeth where his silver ring was, and she told him, but he was not happy with her reply and said she must come home with him. Elizabeth said there would be murder if she went with him and refused to go. This annoyed Thomas, and he struck out at Elizabeth, hitting her around the back of the head. Almost immediately Elizabeth swayed and fell to the floor. Thomas by now left, and a couple who Elizabeth had been drinking with carried her into a passage in the hope that some fresh air would revive her. But this did not help, and Elizabeth died just a few minutes after they had moved her. A doctor was called, but nothing could be done, and her body was taken to the mortuary, which at the time would have still been known as the Dead House. The police were sent for, and they went to the home of Thomas Ratchford in Pilgrim Street, where they found Thomas lying on a bed. When he was told what he was to be arrested for, Thomas simply said, "This is a bad job, I only hit her once on the side of the head." The inquest was held the following Monday at the Old Queen's Head pub in Pilgrim Street before Coroner Hoyle. Thomas Ratchford was present for the inquest and appeared to feel upset by the situation that he found himself in. Isabella Smith said she had identified the body as being that of her sister Elizabeth Kirk. She said she believed she had lived with Thomas Ratchford, but she had never met the man until that day, and had not kept in regular contact with her sister for several years. Maria Peacock said she was married to Ralph Peacock, and she had only just met Elizabeth on the Friday afternoon before her death. She said she had been in a public house in Pilgrim Street in the company of her husband Ralph. She also saw some other people talking with Elizabeth and her husband, but she did not take much notice of them. She said her husband left with her, and she did not see Elizabeth again until the following morning. She said on the Saturday morning she saw Elizabeth going into the Ridley Arms again with her husband Ralph, so she followed them inside. She said Ralph ordered them all a glass of beer, and after he had drank his, he had gone out to buy some tobacco, leaving her in the pub with Elizabeth. She said shortly after this, Thomas Ratchford came into the pub looking for Elizabeth. Maria said he came up to her and said, "Where is the silver ring of mine that you have?" She said Elizabeth told him, "It's in the cream jug on the mantel where you keep your matches." She said she was not sure if Thomas believed her, but he wanted her to return home to look for it. And she said Elizabeth said she would not, saying, "I am not going home, for there will be murder if I do." Maria said Thomas said something else to Elizabeth and then struck out at her on the back or side of her head. Elizabeth, Maria said, seemed to reel from this blow and swayed towards her before falling onto the floor. She said Elizabeth was later carried into the passage where she could get some air. After this, Elizabeth said she went to a chemist's shop, however she did not say what she went for, and on her way back she met Thomas and she told him she felt Elizabeth was dying and that he should go and find a doctor. She said he came and looked at Elizabeth and then he left, she thought, to find a doctor, but he did not return and she did not see him again after this. John Miles said he had been present in the pub in Pilgrim Street on the morning of the crime. He saw Elizabeth and Maria talking and drinking together, and he saw Thomas arrive. He did not hear everything that was said between the couple, but he believed that Thomas had asked about a ring. He saw him take hold of Elizabeth's arm, and a moment later he saw him strike her about the head. He believed he had hit her near to her ear, and he also saw Elizabeth collapse onto the floor. William McKay said he lived in Byker and was in the Ridley Arms on the morning of August the 12th. He also saw Elizabeth and Maria talking and saw Thomas arrive. He did not hear the conversation between Thomas and Elizabeth, but he did see him hit her around the head and saw her fall. He said by this time Ralph Peacock had returned to the pub, and he said he had helped him to carry Elizabeth into the passage. She did not regain consciousness and died a short time later. It was stated that a doctor had been sent for, but nothing could be done for Elizabeth, and she was taken to the dead house. And Dr. Hume said he had performed the post-mortem on the body of Elizabeth Kirk on the Saturday evening. He said externally there were no signs of violence, but internally he found that her head was full of blood, and there was a clot at the lower part of the brain, and this he believed had been the cause of death, because it had been causing pressure on her brain. He said death would have occurred in only a few minutes, and he also stated that Elizabeth had an enlarged liver, something he found was often present in those who were heavy drinkers. He believed this would have caused the blood vessels to rupture more easily than they would in someone who was not prone to drinking. Inspector Kennedy said he had found Thomas Ratchford at his home in Pilgrim Street at around 9:20 a.m. on the Saturday morning. He said he was lying upon a bed and was not wearing his boots or coat. He did not seem to be too concerned about Elizabeth, but when Inspector Kennedy told him of her death, he said Thomas replied saying, "This is a bad job." Inspector Kennedy replied that yes it was, and Thomas then said, "I only hit her once on the side of the head." He said he did not say any more after this, and he was taken to the police station on a charge of wilful murder. Inspector Kennedy ended by saying at the time of his arrest he did not feel that Thomas had been drinking. The coroner said it was for the jury to decide if they believed that Thomas had been responsible for the death of Elizabeth. This did not seem to be a case of murder, but one he believed to be a case of manslaughter. The jury retired for only a short time before returning a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against Thomas Ratchford, and he was committed for trial. It was said that he was first taken to the cells of Manners Police Station before being removed to Newcastle Prison, and that a large crowd had followed him to the police station. This was actually quite normal for the time, as people were often fascinated by all aspects of murder or manslaughter and would follow the cases in the hope of catching a glimpse of the accused. I did not find any details of a funeral for Elizabeth Kirk. Although she did have family in the area, they did not seem to be a close family, and there is no evidence to suggest that they arranged her funeral. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Elizabeth anywhere in the Newcastle area. The trial took place at the Guildhall in Newcastle in December of 1871, and Thomas pleaded not guilty to the charge of manslaughter. As with last week's story, the majority of the evidence given at the trial was the same as that of the inquest, and sadly, again, I could not find any information of the prosecution or the judge's speeches, so I will only add the new information at this point. Maria Peacock gave very much the same evidence as at the inquest, only adding that at one point Thomas had attempted to pull Elizabeth out of the pub, but she had resisted and he had let her go. She said Elizabeth, who, when she fell backwards, with the back of her head hitting the floor. She did not believe that Thomas had struck her a heavy enough blow to cause her to fall. She said she also believed at first that Elizabeth had simply fainted, otherwise she would have sent for a doctor immediately. Mary Ridley said Elizabeth was her sister. She said she was a very heavy drinker. In fact, she felt she was addicted to drink. She said Thomas was also known to drink, and when the couple were both drinking together, they were known to argue over very trivial things. However, when sober, she said Thomas had always appeared to treat her sister kindly. And it was at this point suggested that Elizabeth had been out drinking since Friday afternoon and had not returned to her home, simply moving from one pub to another until she was found in the Ridley Arms on the Saturday morning. Thomas did not give any evidence on his own behalf. The defence stated there was no doubt that the prisoner had struck Elizabeth about the head, but many of the witnesses said this had not been a heavy blow, and he felt the injuries that had caused her death had been due to her falling and hitting her head on the ground. The fall, he felt, could have been caused by Elizabeth taking a fit after she had been struck by Thomas. The jury retired for only a few minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against Thomas Ratchford. But it would seem that the judge had taken note of the defence's suggestion that it had been the fall that had caused Elizabeth's death, more so than Thomas striking her, and he then sentenced him to only 4 months' penal servitude. Thomas was then removed from the dock and taken to Newcastle prison. Before the court was adjourned, a witness who had been due to give evidence in the case was called before the judge. He spoke to him stating he believed him to be drunk. The man denied this, saying he had had very little to drink that day. The judge then said that this was not the way to behave in court, and he was sent to prison for 24 hours. I did not find any further evidence of Thomas Ratchford after this trial. However, it is possible that he continued to live in the North East area after his release, even possibly living in North Shields. I found this to be a very strange case. The newspapers frequently suggested that Elizabeth and Thomas lived together as man and wife, and yet he seemed to see her as more of a worker who helped him to make his caps for sale than as a wife. And it was also not until the trial that we found that the couple were known for their arguments, as no one had mentioned this until Elizabeth's sister spoke of it, so they did not seem to have been very happy together. And it also seems to me that Thomas may have thought Elizabeth had sold his ring to pay for her drink, and he wanted her to prove she had not done this, and when she refused to return home with him, he had lashed out in anger. It had been suggested that she had been drinking the previous day, so in her drunken state, the blow to her head may have made her unsteady on her feet and caused her to fall. It also seems to me that it may well have been the case that hitting her head on the ground was the main cause of her injuries and her death. And I do think the jury were right to find Thomas guilty of manslaughter, as had he not hit her, she may not have fallen and hit her head on the ground. But I do not really feel that 4 months' imprisonment was enough punishment for causing her death. But what do you think? Do you think Thomas simply lost his temper and her death was an accident? Do you think the jury was right to find him guilty of manslaughter? And do you think 4 months was enough punishment for what he had done? Do you think that the fall was the main cause of her death? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.